Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing incredibly well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm delighted you've joined me for a story tonight. And have I got a fabulous story for you? You're going to just love it. Started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I defy that anyone would ever welcome a knock at their front door at a god-forsaken hour of the morning or night, when the sky is as black as a bottle of ink, where not even the trills of the bird's song have trespassed through this murky black veil with their cheerful dawn chorus. Indeed, it was far too early for that. Moments before I had been obliviously unaware of what was soon to transpire, lying comfortably fast asleep in my sumptuous four-poster Victorian bed, underneath the folds of my gloriously cushy goose-down duvet, in my bedroom on the second floor of my old Victorian property, where I had resided rather luxuriously, I might add, over the last 25 years or so. I lived near Avery Street in the bluegrass state of Kentucky, in the old Louisville area that was once known as the Southern Extension, where my home is one among many of the 48 city blocks of old restored Victorians built in the 1870s or thereabouts. Ostensibly for me, this old Louisville area invites the rich history from our past to remain vibrantly alive in our current times. My home over the years has become what I consider an extension of myself, and leaving it or selling it for me would be like losing an arm or a leg. I know they say you should never get attached to an inanimate object, but the indelible influences of lives once lived in my home certainly mean that the footprints of others long gone have left a sweet essence in my home, like a fragrant bouquet that made my house feel very much as if it is far from an inanimate object, as if my house actually breathes, and indeed I believe it actually does. Every house has its own smell, and when you've been away from home for a while, the first thing that greets you on your return is the fragrance of familiarity, the smell of lavender polish intermingled with the citrus and clove scents from your bowl of pot puree in the entrance hall, the traces of a vanilla candle you regularly burn, and maybe an underlying scent of a much-loved pet that you are unaware that you can actually smell. In short, there is no smell better than the sweet smell of home, as I'm sure you can testify. In truth, I could never imagine living anywhere else in the entire world than in this precious home of mine. The house had been left to me by a very discerning late grandmother, who had gleaned how much I loved her residence as a child, and saw the reflections of herself in me, as if she was looking in the mirror. I think she perceived that even in my callow naivety and youthful ignorance, that I knew instinctively that her house was a whole lot more than just bricks and mortar. When I told her that her house was very special and the best place in the whole wide world, and that I wished our house was so nice, she looked at me soberly for a moment, as if absorbing my words like a hungry sponge. "Why is that?" she had asked me, raising a quizzical brow. "You live in a beautiful brand new house, don't you? Designed by an avant-garde architect, ingeniously built to your own parents' specifications. I thought you liked it. It is so modern. Your parents both seem terribly pleased with the place. What was the word your mother used? Oh, yes, current, modernistic, very trendy." I wrinkled my nose in disgust. "It's ugly. I don't like it. It doesn't have a heart. I like your house 'cause your house breathes like a dragon. It listens, it hears, and it has a heartbeat." My grandmother looked at me incredulously and said to me, "Well, I never. I will say this about you, Sweet Pea. You are one of the cleverest little girls I've ever met, and you're right on the money about that. My house does have a soul. I think I can safely say, Sweet Pea, you're more than just a pretty little face, aren't you?" By all accounts, I think for my grandmother, my eloquent, passionate words, spoken with such a shrewd, unusual maturity for one so young, with such conviction and passion, clinched the deal for her. I was the one member of our family that saw her house through her eyes. She would swear to me sometimes she'd hear the clip-clop of horses' hooves trotting down the street at night, and the squeaking sound of carriages rolling down the cobbled streets. But I never believed her until I heard them myself, when I moved into my property, and that was something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up on end. Now, like many of the residents that reside in this historic area of Old Louisville, I do believe that memories from the past have left their indelible signatures on this place. Many people in our neighborhood have had unfathomable experiences that they cannot explain. When the past has audaciously crossed over the threshold of our present day, like water seeping through the cracks of a hole in the ceiling and making contact with the interior of your home, crossing over from the past to the present, you could say. Marjorie, my next-door neighbour, for example, a delightful woman in her mid-60s, who always looks frustratingly elegant, come rain, hail or shine, has spoken to me of such outlandish, cryptic crossovers, when the past has come crashing into our present day, like a rambunctious ocean wave galloping towards the shore, like a charging white stallion. Marjorie Fenshaw had a bizarre experience once that is as vivid and lucidly clear to her now as the very day on which it first happened. It would seem that two debonair men, in top hats and tails, knocked on her door at the dead of night, at 25 minutes past 4 in the morning, to be exact. "I was frightened out of my wits," she told me. "I opened the door to two men that looked like they'd stepped out of the pages of an 1800s history book. They told me they were here to see Florence and Oscar Disraeli, and they spoke with very polished, plummy voices, I hasten to say." Marjorie was rather perturbed by this fortuitous, unexpected visitation from these two men. She promptly informed them that no one by that name lived in her house. "You've got the wrong address," she told them, wondering why the two men were dressed in 1800s regalia. Had they come back very late at night from some fancy dress party, she wondered, where the theme was to dress up in the attire of yesteryear? Were they pulling some kind of party stunt on her to freak her out? Because if so, it was working. "But this is the address, surely, of Mr. and Mrs. Disraeli," one of the men insisted, his brown eyes fixed pleadingly on her. "I'm very sorry to intrude on you, ma'am, at this very late hour of the night, but it is of extreme urgency that I speak to my brother, Mr. Oscar Disraeli. I have some dreadful news to impart to him that concerns him greatly. Our mother is close to breathing her very last, I'm afraid. She is gravely ill and is close to breathing her last. My brother needs to come with me at once to bid her farewell, for time, as you can appreciate, is of the essence in this urgent matter. We need to make haste." My next-door neighbour stared at them faintly and said, "I'm dreadfully sorry. You must have your wires crossed somewhere. No one by the name Disraeli lives here." The man, who claimed to be Oscar Disraeli's brother, looked very confused. He lifted up his hat and promptly placed it back on his head and said apologetically, "I'm very sorry, ma'am, for intruding on your privacy at this late hour." And with that they walked away, but my neighbour could hear them engaging in chatter as they disappeared from view. Marjorie was to find out later that the house had been purchased by an Oscar Disraeli in the summer of 1874, and that revelation made her wonder if she'd experienced a paranormal encounter of people from a bygone time reappearing in our time-space, for she heard no accounts of any party in the area where people had dressed in the costumes of the 1800s. My friend Marjorie had long been a skeptic about ghostly phenomenon, but her experience at her front door had been a huge paradigm shift in her life, and after moving into the old Victoria next door to me, she had experienced strange phenomena that made her certain that our soul lives on forever. She also claims to have heard the horse's hooves and the carriage rolling down our street between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. The next day she claimed a red cardinal had flown into her house, and the bird reappeared for 7 days. She felt that the bird, making its strange appearance, was in some way connected to her idiosyncratic, outer-worldly experience, of which she had no rational explanation, but is in no doubt that this event rarely happened. My grandmother wanted to keep her old Victorian house in the Dunlop family, and passing it on to me would mean it was in safe hands and would not be disregarded or sold off to a perfect stranger. My own mother would never appreciate this nostalgic home that she had grown up in as a girl, and when my grandmother left the place to me, she didn't even bat an eyelid. My mother proudly gravitated towards cold, modernistic houses made of steel and glass, with minimalistic furnishings and style, stark white walls, and very little character. I think she thought all houses that bore the hallmarks of yesteryear should be exposed to a wrecking ball, so that the entire world could become a bland, concrete jungle. But I'm glad that people like her and their rigid opinions about current trends are in the minority. Well, at least I hope they are, as in my opinion, houses from the past are a rich representation of our fabulous history. So when I heard the loud knocking at my front door, I held my breath for a moment and groaned. I did not want to get out of bed. The unwelcome, stagnantly cold air around me was icy. The rapping demanded my immediate attention, a resolutely invasive sound done with determination that you unequivocally knew would rudely continue until you answered the door, as if the person on the other side absolutely knew you were at home. My first thoughts were of two Victorian men, the very same ones that Marjorie had encountered at a god-forsaken hour 2 years prior. It was not unreasonable for me to wonder if those two phantoms from the past that Marjorie had encountered were now knocking on my door, asking for Oscar and Florence Disraeli. I mean, stranger things have happened, have they not? But I was not eager for this to happen to me, as the idea of meeting two ghostly spectres at this god-forsaken hour of the morning left me crumbling at the knees, and my heart fluttering like a nervous bird that has found himself embedded in the claws of the household tabby. I glanced at my bedside table. The clock on my nightstand read 10 minutes past 4 in the morning. It was hardly a wonder I was thinking about ghosts. I mean, who in their right mind bangs on your door at this ungodly time? The knocking continued. It was mid-spring, and the temperature in the early mornings and evenings still remained briskly cold. I pushed my reluctant feet into my fleece-lined slippers and slipped my arms through the warm sleeves of my dressing gown, tying the belt around my middle. I'm not sure why I didn't peer outside my window to the street below, but maybe I was afraid of what I might see. I trudged down the dark, creaking staircase to the lower landing of the first floor, where the floorboards groaned beneath my feet, as if they too had been annoyingly woken up. I meandered through the hallway passage towards the front door, where I rattled the chains behind the door to unlatch it, and very slowly it swung open on its hinges. There were 2 police officers, a man and a woman, standing there in my doorway, their dark, shadowy silhouettes dappled by the pale light of the moon. This I did not expect to see. It was possibly a worse, more unwelcome sight than encountering 2 ghostly Victorian gentlemen. My heart began to pound violently in my chest, and I felt a prescient of something untoward tingle down my spine, as my hands became strangely clammy, and a prickle of sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I mean, policemen did not randomly drop in on you if they were not about to bombard you with some bad news. But I tried to think of who could have died. I couldn't think of anyone that I was close enough to command this kind of interruption, which made me feel suddenly quite alone in the world, as when it came to family tragedies, I was unlikely to be the very first person the police would likely contact, so their incongruous presence at my door invited in the blurry fog of my mind more questions than answers. "Hello, madam. Good evening. You are Mrs. Scarlett Dunlop, is that right?" I nodded. "That's right. What is this about, officer?" Both the police officers exchanged withered glances between each other, as if what they were about to tell me was not something that they were eager to convey, an ugly part of their job that they would sooner avoid. They turned around to look at me, their eyes edged with pity. The policeman brought out his gold badge, which glittered in the moonlight, and then asked if he might come in, and apologized for imposing on me at this early hour of the morning. I should think so, I thought. I led them into the living room, where unplumped cushions lay tossed against a large sofa, and my black and white cat Barnacle opened up a yellow eye, one after another, at our fortuitous unwelcome visitors, with a very unappreciative wary gaze. He promptly decided he did not like their rude intrusion, and stretched out his nimble body by arching out his back, pushing his legs forward into a downward dog posture. Then, wasting no time, he bounded off the couch and sashayed out of the room, swinging his tail up and down, as if to say, "I'm not going to put up with all this nonsense at this obscene hour of the morning. Who do you think I am?" I knew exactly how he felt. I'd like to have followed his wise lead, but I politely remained anchored to my living-room floor, my ears unwilling to hear what the officers had to say. There was a china plate on the oakwood coffee table, covered in crumbs, and a little crust of bread left over from last night's dinner, a half-drunk cup of coffee, and several sweet wrappers that were scattered over the table like rose petals. I reached up to clear them away, possibly looking for a useful distraction, as busying myself has always helped to still the turbulence running amuck in my mind when I'm troubled. The male police officer told me to sit down and not to worry about cleaning up, as he had something very important to tell me. His sombre words rang in my head like a clamorous church bell. My heart began to race as it fluttered in my chest. As resigned to facing the storm of these police officers' revelations, I obeyed his suggestion, and with a vacillating hesitancy, I unwillingly sank into the pillowy couch. The police officers did the same on the chairs opposite to mine. I noticed one of the chairs was covered with a long line of recently washed socks that I had brought in from the rain, that were drying out on the side of the chair. An odd place to put them, I know. The two officers' eyes pinned in on me as they spoke very soberly. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Dunlop. There is no easy way to tell you this," he said with a sombre expression on his face. "I'm afraid we have some bad news for you. Very bad news." My chest tightened as I felt as if the air from my lungs had been expunged. "I regret to tell you, Mrs. Dunlop, but your husband has been killed. Is there anyone we can call on your behalf to give you comfort at this grievous time? We are very sorry for your loss." "What?" I said. "What did you say?" I was trying to make sense of the officer's words, but they eluded me. It was almost as if everything he was saying became like background noise, like a waterfall, heavy traffic, or even the sound of a static radio. And when I looked at him, he became like a character on a silent movie, speaking to me with an open mouth going up and down, so I didn't hear a single word he was saying. For it would seem there is a switch in your ears that you can turn to mute very conveniently when you don't want to hear the cruel blows of harsh words that can hit across your face with the forceful ferocity of a large hailstone. "Mrs. Dunlop," said the policeman, crinkling his brow, "I don't think you heard me. I'm sorry to inform you, your husband Miller Dunlop is deceased. He was killed about 3 days ago, I'm afraid. It has only just been confirmed that the scant remains uncovered at the site belonged to your husband, so it was very important to let you know immediately about our discovery. As I was saying, we are very, very sorry for your loss." "What? Miller is dead?" I gasped. "That can't be." I covered my hand over my mouth and looked exceedingly bewildered, but the officer's salient words refused to penetrate the blurry fog of my confusion, to gel into an image that I could actually entertain. "I know this is a terrible shock for you," said the young female police officer, studying me studiously with sympathy in her brown eyes. She pulled the whispers of long brown hair that escaped out of her ponytail behind her ears. She was young, in her early 20s, and she pulled out a tissue from her jacket, which she handed to me, as if she was expecting me to burst into tears. I took the tissue gratefully from her, and dabbed the dry area under my eyes as if mopping away tears. At the time it seemed the right thing to do, even though no tears were actually forthcoming. "I'll go and make you a cup of tea. Sweet tea, shall I?" she said, raising herself up from the chair rather nimbly, and noisily walking across the parquet floor, where I could hear her cluttering around in my kitchen, preparing me a cup of tea, along with the gurgling sounds of the pipes being switched on and off, as she poured water into a kettle and rummaged around in my kitchen cabinets to find cups and saucers, sugar and tea, I imagined. Good luck with that, I thought. My kitchen was not terribly ordered or very organised, and if you didn't know that I kept my tea bags in a biscuit barrel that looked like a chef, it could be a struggle to find them. The police officer crossed his legs, running a hand over his day-old stubble on his jaw. His steely grey eyes remained fixed on me. "I take it, ma'am. This has come as a bolt out of the blue for you. A terrible shock. I'm sorry to be the bearer of such bad tidings. But these fortuitous events happen, and they are inevitably most unfortunate." I stared at him rather blankly, as if I was looking right through him, like a pane of glass. Miller had been killed. None of this made any sense to me at all. How could this have happened to him? He was so young. "I haven't seen my husband for 7 years," I told him. The police officer's eyes popped open in confoundment. He began to glance around my living room to see if he could see any evidence of my husband's presence around the house. An old photograph, perhaps, a detective novel, a pile of newspapers lying on the side of a couch. Finally his eyes returned to me, and he began to tap his leg rather awkwardly on the floor. My startling revelation had touched a nerve in him, I suspect, and he seemed somewhat disquieted. 7 years, he said, looking at me aghast. "But I don't understand. I thought—" "That's right. 7 years. It's a long time, I know, if you think about it." "But you are still married to him, ma'am." "That's right, I am. He used to live in this house with me. We were married for 9 years. You could say everything went a little pear-shaped. We grew apart. And one day he left our home, telling me he never wanted to be married, so he never came back." "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. That can't have been very easy for you. Do you still remain in touch with him?" "Well, we did communicate from time to time. He sends me a card at Christmas and on every birthday, but I haven't spoken to him for 7 years. We never formalized a divorce of any kind, but I don't understand how anyone would actually kill him. He was not that kind of person to make enemies for himself. He was quite an unassuming individual who never really caused offence," I said, while the officer nodded his head. I continued, "It would be a struggle for me, officer, to believe Miller could rile up enough emotion in anyone to cause the water in the pool to ripple, if you know what I mean. If you were talking to me about someone who got people's backs up, well, maybe I could understand such a person being killed. But Miller, he'd never provoke anyone to anger. I mean, look at me. I'm the wronged wife. He walked out on me, but even after he did that, I was never really angry. Of course I was upset at first, indignant about paying the bills the both of us procured, and meeting social obligations. But I never felt murderous towards him, never. And ever since he absconded, I've only wished him the very best, and hope he found love that he never found with me. In the end, I knew him leaving was the very best outcome for the both of us. We were like 2 pieces from a different jigsaw puzzle that just never fit together. We tried to make it work, of course, but we couldn't. But I still care about him. Of course I do." The police officer continued to nod. He studied me through his steely eyes, watching my body language intently as he meditated on my words, as I unveiled my thoughts to him. Perhaps he was searching for any clues to see if I surreptitiously might have detonated my ex-husband. Surely he could see I had nothing to hide. I was being transparently forthright and completely open with him. "Over the years, officer, I hasten to say I have torn up any post that arrives here. All the stuff he left behind I gave to a charity shop. I don't have a clue where he lives these days. He never left an address with me, but I had a feeling he moved out of state to Florida." I paused for a moment. "How did it happen, officer? Surely you're not going to tell me it was murder?" At that poignant moment, the female officer entered the living room, holding a mug of sweet tea in her hands, matched by a sympathetic smile on her face that she warmly directed at me. So she had found the tea bags in the chef container. But then she was a police officer after all, whose job is to find things, answers, missing people, drug cartels, murderers. It would seem she'd been in my kitchen for far too long to boil a kettle and make a cup of tea. I sneakily suspected she'd been reading the notes pinned on my refrigerator, snooping and scanning around the room for any signs of my ex-husband. She handed me the mug of tea and said, "I made it hot, and I put 4 sugars in it. I always find in circumstances like this, one should make the tea sweet. Sugar is very good for shock." With an unsteady hand I reached out to grab the tea from her tentatively, and I took a sip. Normally I did not drink sugar in my tea, but on this occasion the sugar rarely seemed to settle my frenzied nerves. Miller, the man I'd been married to for over 9 years, was now deceased. Even though it had been a long time ago, it really felt as if I'd been brutally stung by a Portuguese man of war, as despite everything, I had loved this man once. But his tragic demise tugged at my heartstrings and was almost impossible to digest, as if I had a large stone stuck in the back of my throat that simply would not go down. "So what happened to Miller?" I asked the officer. "I mean, how did he die? You were saying he was killed. Does that mean he was murdered?" I took another sip of my tea, surprised that my fingers trembled and shook, and some tea went spilling over the edge of my mug, onto the floor below, but I ignored it, as my questioning gaze remained steadily fixed on the police officer's face. "It was a gas explosion, ma'am," he told me. "A gas explosion?" I repeated. "Where? How? When? What about a funeral? Do I need to make arrangements for his burial because we're not divorced? Will I be expected to identify his body?" "That won't be necessary, ma'am. You could have a memorial service, I suspect. But there is not much left of the charred remains." I'm not sure everything the officer said, as much of my interaction with the both of them washed over me like a wave on the seashore, erasing the footprints that were once there. Likewise, it's difficult to remember the intimate details of a moment in my life when time stood still, when the long drawn-out morning dragged painfully slowly, at a snail's pace, when I heard Marjorie, my neighbour, slamming the front door behind her, as she took little Twinkletoes, her white Pekingese, for his morning walk. It was strange I did not grieve, even for what potentially could have been, if our relationship had not been so badly shipwrecked by the tempestuous currents that life unwittingly throws at you. I felt sad, of course, for Miller, especially dying at the young age of 40, long before his time. It was a little like hearing of a long-lost relative that had kicked the bucket, but even the news of a distant person who died tragically and very suddenly is never easy to hear. It did, of course, make me relive the forgotten years of our marriage, as if looking at that time in my life through a distant pair of binoculars, with a detached, apathetic insouciance, but also a fondness for times past, where I'd thoroughly enjoyed my ex-husband's companionship. By all accounts, despite everything, he was a good man. He wasn't desperately colourful, was undistinguished, never the life and soul of the party. To look at, he was pretty nondescript, but beneath the layers of his mediocrity was a precious jewel which I had uncovered in him when I met him, which was why we'd married in the first place, as I saw in him the gold in his heart. But like 2 passing ships in the night, neither of us belonged in the same port. The male officer, Vincent O'Brien was his name, cleared his throat. "The explosion, man, happened on an abandoned property in the woods, which only enjoys a house guest 2 or 3 times a year. An uncle, I believe, who rather likes the place. It's called Gladstone Hall. It would seem the place had propane heating, would you believe? I understand a cylinder got damaged. Maybe your husband lit a cigarette or knocked over a candle, and the place burnt down over 3 days. I believe there's nothing left of the place. It was a couple of walkers that called it in. They knew the property very well, and were mortified to discover it had been burnt to the ground. I believe it was a fabulous-looking mansion. They were curious enough to investigate the premises, and saw the smoulderings of the aftermath of the fire. But thankfully the fire was contained, and never spread, as it could certainly have damaged the entire countryside. At this point in time your husband's death is considered a dreadful accident, but it would be remiss of us not to ask you if anyone may have wanted him dead, and purposely blown the place down with him inside, although that looks increasingly unlikely. If it's any consolation to you, ma'am, I think the smoke would likely have killed him long before his body was attacked by those flames, which suggests he must have fallen asleep."
If indeed he had been awake, he would have likely got out of the house in time, before any real damage was done, although you can never be sure about things like that.
When I thought of my ex-husband's smoking habit, I could recall a plethora of times when he'd fallen asleep with a cigarette in his hands, and on 2 occasions he'd burnt our carpet, and once set alight a stack of newspapers that I was forced to put out. My brow furrowed as I looked at the officers. I told you Miller did not have any enemies. People naturally liked him, but he wasn't that kind of passionate person that would make anyone angry enough to harm him, so none of this makes any sense to me.
It was as we thought, said the officer, nodding his head,
and holding the gaze of the female officer, as if they were both in agreement of this fact. The female officer nodded her head in response, and I felt relieved that they clearly did not think I had any connection to my ex-husband's demise, and that his tragic passing had indeed been a fortuitous accident. The officer cleared his throat.
We found your husband's wallet, ma'am, a dog tag with his name on it, and a signet ring, along with a few bodily remains that have been positively identified as belonging to your husband. So it is a tragic turn of events, I'm afraid. We are very, very sorry for your loss.
Could you tell me, officer, more about this place, Gladstone Hall, that you describe? I've never heard of it before. Was this where Miller was actually living? The officer shrugged his shoulders, glanced at his female colleague, who nodded, as if she was giving him the go-ahead to tell me about the place where my husband had met his end. The officer once again played with the stubble on his chin, which I guessed was a self-soothing gesture, his eyes never leaving mine for a moment.
No, your husband did not live at Gladstone Hall. It might surprise you to know his apartment is not far from your residence. I would say he lives 30 minutes away from you. Well, he lived. In the Bluegrass State, of course.
I had no idea. If that's the case, what was he doing at this Gladstone Hall? You say it's abandoned, but if the uncle visits the place 3 times a year, I'd hardly call it that.
Well, it's not really abandoned. You're right about that. Gladstone Hall is reputed to being haunted, said the officer. It's not far from the Cumberland River. About 2.5 hours' drive from here. It's in a remote, very countrified location, far off the beaten track. It's often used by those in the know for ghost hunting investigations, to stay overnight, and to see if they can pick up recordings of paranormal activity. After gaining permission, of course, from the owners of the place. The real owners abandoned living there years ago, claiming that their lives had been plagued by an unseen ghostly entity called Chester that wanted them off his premises. I gather someone had been murdered in the house in the 1800s, and places like that excite paranormal investigators, rather like the Lizzie Borden house, although not many people knew about Gladstone Hall, apart from a select few in the know. In the 1800s, a woman called Giselle Tennyson inherited the house. It was rumoured that when her father died, he left the property to his daughter, which was exceedingly unusual in those days. Mr. Tennyson favoured his daughter Giselle, believing his son Chester could not be trusted to receive the family inheritance, as he had brought shame on the family name, and was reputed to being a layabout and a drunk who hung around places of ill repute, brothels and such, and on one occasion wanted to marry one of the women from that brothel, which went down with his father like a lead balloon, as you can imagine. I gather Giselle was found with a rope around her head, hanging in the closet at Gladstone Hall. Very tragic story by all accounts. Police said at the time that it was self-inflicted and a suicide, but everyone who knew Giselle said she'd never have taken her own life. She loved life too much, and was looking forward to marrying her sweetheart, a man called George Silverstone. Most of the locals in the area believed Giselle's brother Chester had killed her in a moment of unbridled jealousy, to make it look like a suicide, so he could guilefully get away with murder, and hopefully inherit the property, so that Gladstone Hall became his, which inevitably it did, and he did end up marrying the girl from the brothel that would have made his father turn in his grave. He emphatically believed Gladstone Hall belonged to him, and in those days the firstborn son inherited everything, so he was determined to kill his sister, in order to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. And it seems even from beyond the grave he's making his claim. In the 1980s, the new owners of Gladstone Hall moved into that house very happily, until things went badly awry. They never sold the place, as I keep telling you, so it remains in their family name. The family believed the ghost of Chester Tennyson was unleashing his furious wrath upon them, and this was confirmed by a psychic investigator who visited Gladstone Hall and claimed the angry ghost of Chester Tennyson wanted them out of their house. Many attempts were made to remove the ghostly entity from the premises with holy water, prayers, sage, but Chester Tennyson kept returning. They'd wake up with scratches and bruises all over their body, and a screaming voice in their ears telling them to get out. Smashed crockery would be lying all around the house. The last straw was when the mother of the house, who was 6 months pregnant at the time, lost her baby to a spontaneous miscarriage after being pushed down the staircase by an unseen pair of hands. Ever since then, people who know the tragic tale of the happenings at Gladstone Hall over the years have been trespassing on the premises for ghost hunting investigations, sometimes with permission from the owners, sometimes not. They stay overnight there to record stuff, like disembodied voices, you know the sort of things. In recent years, ghost hunting expeditions have gained a great deal of notoriety and a plethora of television coverage that has sparked a great deal of interest to the public in the matter. I looked at the officer, nonplussed. My ex-husband and ghost hunting, I think, would be as far removed from each other as my front porch is from the London Bridge, and I don't say that remotely lightly. I mean, I lived in this old Victorian house with Miller, and when something strange happened here that could not be explained, like Miller discovering the keys he knew he'd left on the hall table, mysteriously lying at the bottom of the fish tank, without any explanation for how they actually got there, Miller would not believe for a single moment it could have been paranormal. He was cynical in that regard, very cynical. Officer, I cannot understand what Miller was actually doing at Gladstone Hall. It makes no sense to me at all. Well, I imagine he was doing what many others like him have done before at Gladstone Hall, possibly hanging around to record paranormal activity. But it would seem he was all on his own. People on ghost hunting investigations rarely do research on their own. It's a tad unusual to go it alone. I wouldn't do it myself, even if the house was in relatively good nick, which I believe Gladstone Hall definitely was. The family kept the place in very good condition, as they were considering the possibility of one day putting it on the market. And as I said, the uncle would stay at the hall, unconcerned about any paranormal claims. He thought it was all mumbo-jumbo, stuff and nonsense. I threw my hands up in the air in exasperation, looking more and more bewildered. I had been married to Miller for 7 years. He was the last person in the world I'd envisage was remotely interested in paranormal activity. Certainly in the years I'd known him, he would have pooh-poohed the idea of such research. What could have happened in his life to arise in him a keen interest in something like this? People change, Mrs. Dunlop, said the officer, almost as if he was reading my mind. You and your ex-husband have been apart for 7 years, I'd like to remind you. Let me see. 7 years ago, I'd go to a restaurant and order the same dreary food, day in and day out. I'd never even bother to open a menu. I'd tell the waitress, cheeseburger and chips, please, without any salad. You can ask the wife. She'd get exasperated with me, saying I was a dreadful bore. Nowadays, I'm more of an adventurous eater than she is. I put my wife to shame, because I will try anything. I even ate a sheep's eyeball once. It was delicious, I hasten to say. When my mother recently went out with us for dinner, she said to me, "What happened to the young boy who refused to even touch a vegetable?" as she watched me tucking into my large plate of creamed spinach, sprinkled with a plethora of Gruyere cheese. So yes, I think we do change. I'm sure if you look at yourself more closely, Mrs. Dunlop, you will find you've changed over the years. I tried to reflect on the officer's words. Had I changed since I last saw Miller? Would he still consider me the same person he knew 7 years ago? I was sure I had not changed that much.
I had become more independent and resourceful after Miller had gone. I had rebuilt my life from the dregs of a relationship that had spontaneously combusted, but I still cared for the man very much, whom I'd loved at one point in time. I had married him in the hope we'd grow old together, and even though that had not happened, I still cared, and the thought of his final ending, caught up in the fiery tentacles of a burning manor house, gave me a longing to visit the place where he had met his end. As to why that was, your guess is as good as mine. So there we are. That's the end of part 1 of our story. I wonder what happens when she goes to the manor house. When she goes to Gladstone Hall, what will she find? Your guess is as good as mine, so don't forget to join me tomorrow night for part 2 of our story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.